So let's look at an example of how this played out in the Republic of Georgia, which in 2003 had what was billed as the Rose Revolution. There was a pro-democracy movement with significant Western assistance, which orchestrated a peaceful revolution against the non-Democrats in power. Georgia's Rose Revolution pushed out of power Edward Shevardnadze, a quintessential post-communist ruler, if a bit on the liberal side of the non-democratic spectrum. Shevardnadze began his career in the brutal Stalin years in the Soviet Union. He eventually became the Georgian Republic's Minister of Public Order and then the Interior Minister. Ironically, you'll see why it's ironic in a few minutes, he rose to power promising to root out corruption, which meant going hard against the grain of the Soviet state, in particular in the 1960s and 70s, under Brezhnev. He stood up against graft when embezzlement, bribery, falsified production records were increasingly what the Soviet system was built upon. Remember the everyday resistance. I was part of that. And he stood up against corruption. And thanks to his anti-corruption credentials, Shevardnadze became Mikhail Gorbachev's foreign minister in the 1980s, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. And he oversaw the greatest ever thaw in Soviet relations with the West. He seemed this great Democrat. He helped bring about the end of the Cold War. He helped, with Gorbachev, bring about the end of the Soviet Union, whether he wanted to or not. Now, Shevardnadze returned to Tbilisi in 1992 after the Soviet Union had collapsed and his native Georgia was in the throes of a civil war. You had two regions in Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which demanded independence from Georgia. And then you had the cratered streets of the capital, which echoed with the sounds of gunfire from a classic power struggle that had nothing to do with the ethnic-based separatism. After a 1992 coup, Shevardnadze became chairman of the Georgian State Council, effectively ruling the country. It was a less than democratic arrival, but Shevardnadze was still really a welcome relief to those who were uncomfortable with this nationalist regime of Zviad Gamzahurdia. Shevardnadze was assigned the role of president by a freely elected parliament in 1992, and then he was formally elected president by the people in free and fair elections in 1995. Not the typical template in a post-Soviet country, free and fair elections in the 1990s. In the mid-1990s, Shevardnadze had these strong democratic credentials, which helped him bring Georgia into major international organizations, like the United Nations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, etc. Georgians who largely identified with Europe, felt themselves Europeans, passed this legitimacy back to Shevardnadze. Georgia seemed like a democracy success story. Despite Georgia's system of strong presidentialism and a dominant state press, Georgia had opposition parties. It had an independent media and a plethora of pro-reform NGOs. These NGOs were rooted in a civil society that had been active since the late 1980s. This period of glasnost, this period of openness in the Soviet Union, when organizations formed really to take up popular grievances that were unaddressed by the Soviet state. At first, these were less political aims back in the Soviet period, like environment and culture, and later, in the late 1980s, they moved into spheres like political liberalization and demands for autonomy. Under Shevardnadze, NGOs became more involved in programs designed to increase the rule of law in Georgia, independent Georgia, right? To further human rights in Georgia and to ensure democratic accountability. Over time, though, the Georgian state became more and more corrupt and less democratic under Shevardnadze. And this meant that young Western educated individuals saw these NGOs as their only option for decent employment. They were a tool through which they could apply their newly gained knowledge to effect incremental change within their own country. Leaders in power, for their part, largely left NGOs and the independent media alone. They even paid lip service to them, as long as they were perceived to present no real challenge. They routinely solicited NGO opinions. They heard out NGO complaints to maintain a good democratic image, but they largely ignored them in practice. Classic competitive authoritarian regime. Maybe competitive authoritarian light. This budding civil society, which was fueled by Western assistance, created its own new set of elites who strove to shape international and domestic political public opinion. As the strength of these NGOs increased, especially in the capital, Shevardnadze began to see them and democratization more broadly as a threat. And there were major reasons to. This was more a threat as the economy struggled. From 1997 to 2002, you had only about 2% average economic growth. Unemployment in the early 2000s stood at around 17%. Corruption was rife. Influence was for sale at nearly every level for the right price. Most Georgians couldn't afford that right price. So you had economic hardship and the state's failure to provide basic services and guarantees like social welfare. These left Shevardnadze with miserable approval ratings and pushed him even further from democracy. If you can't get the people's support, steal their support in the falsified elections. The government began to attack independent media. And then it sought to drown out the voice of independent NGOs by creating and backing pro-governmental organizations, what we call GONGOs, government-organized non-governmental organizations. Shevardnadze used the state media to portray NGOs as grant grubbers, promoting foreign values, weakening the Georgian state. By 2000, Shevardnadze was increasingly viewed by international actors as empowered only thanks to electoral tricks and a highly weak and fragmented political opposition. Western states backed non-governmental organizations throughout this period. They saw them as vital for democracy, as Shevardnadze turned away from democracy. NGO leaders aligned themselves internally with political opponents who were within the state, known as the Young Reformers, people like Mikhail Saakashvili, Zurab Zvanya. These guys branded themselves the truly quote-unquote Western pro-democracy choice, and they joined in anti-regime NGO activities. So now you have an alliance between political opposition parties that had relatively little power under Shevardnadze's rule, but were allowed to exist, and these pro-democracy NGOs, which also had relatively little power, but were allowed to exist. Again, illiberal, competitive, authoritarian regime. The ingredients were there. By 2002, two core opposition parties joined together in the consensus that Shevardnadze had to go. NGOs formed this crucial pillar of opposition to the government. In the run-up to the 2003 elections, they declared the democratic process was irreparably broken. Falsification was inevitable. Now, to mobilize from above, pro-democracy organizations needed to engage in a multi-pronged attack on the regime. And they did. And this involved 1. Raising citizen awareness. 2. Organizing get-out-the-vote campaigns. 3. Monitoring the elections. I've talked about how crucial this has been. And 4. Demonstrating to citizens that they were not alone in their disillusionment after those falsified elections. And here's that slide for everything I just discussed. The Rose Revolution was a classic, what we call electoral revolution. It followed the Serbian model and blazed the way for others to come. So following rigged elections, pro-democracy and human rights NGOs used their ostensibly more objective stature to bolster the political opposition. Right? Politicians are always discredited to some degree. Right? People always say, oh, they're just politicians. But now you had these NGOs that are ostensibly more objective, bolstering opposition claims against the incumbents and helping to coordinate mobilization efforts. So NGOs use their alliances with the media to amass evidence of fraud and inform the public that the status quo was rotten. Many of the organizations that made up Georgia's pro-democracy social movement had been around for years. They usually operated independently of each other in the name of specific democratic reforms rather than democracy per se. They suffered from resource dependency to a large degree. Prior to and during the revolution, they now mobilized together to raise awareness. They served as election observers. They provided legal aid to organizations that were harassed for their election-related activities. They provided independent election counts. Other NGOs took on the role of mobilizer during the revolution, like the Kamara youth movement, Kamara meaning enough, which was patterned exactly on the Serbian youth movement known as Otpor, resistance. These youth often created the appearance of being much larger or more representative than they really were. So Kamara, for instance, began as this kitchen-style organization of a few dozen students. Those who came out after the elections marched in front of cameras. They got maybe hundreds of students to come out with them. But they made lots of noise and marched around in front of the cameras, creating the image of a highly mobilized youth. It looked like there could be thousands, tens of thousands of them out there. Those cameras, which portrayed these youth, were run by an organization known as Rustavi 2. It was an independent media outlet that repeatedly showed citizens that they'd been defrauded in the elections and that their compatriots were out there in the streets. They should go too. 2 days after the elections, 3 core opposition parties created a united opposition front, threatening mass demonstrations if the Electoral Commission did not recognize opposition victory. NGOs gave cheated political candidates a credibility and an impartiality that they otherwise lacked. Georgia was paralyzed by demonstrations during this period, despite the Shevardnadze refused to back down in the first weeks after the elections. Now, when Shevardnadze finally sought to convene his new parliament nearly 3 weeks after the elections, Saakashvili, this leader of the opposition, and his supporters, with around 100,000 protesters behind them, took over Georgia's parliament building with roses in their hands. Shevardnadze escaped out a back door, and later he officially resigned from his post, and the Rose Revolution was over.